Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. The three Vile Emperor Dynasty Celestials hadn't anticipated encountering such a large group. They had been lying in wait near the exit, and when they detected strange fluctuations in the distance, had come to investigate. To their shock, they saw Bai Xiaochun and all of the other Celestials from the Saint Emperor Dynasty. If Virupaksha had been there, he might have been able to block their path with force. But Prince Demon's cultivation base wasn't high enough, prompting a gasp on his part. Reverend Devourer's eyes went wide, and he even considered just backing down. However, he knew that since Bai Xiaochun was here, along with his allies, if they got through while he himself remained completely uninjured, it would arouse the anger of his fellow Celestials, as well as the rage of the Vile Emperor. "They have the item His Majesty the Vile Emperor desires," he shouted. "Don't let them through." By stating everything openly, and also mentioning the Vile Emperor, he left no wiggle room for the others. Prince Demon cursed inwardly, but knew that he had no options. After sending messages to Virupaksha and the others, he unleashed the power of his cultivation base. Gongsun Wan'er sighed. She had no desire to fight with Bai Xiaochun, but they were both on opposing sides at the moment, so she could only power up her cultivation base and join Reverend Devourer and Prince Demon to try to block the paths of the Saint Emperor Dynasty Celestials. "Get out of the way!" Gu Tianjun bellowed, performing an incantation gesture that sent 7 swords screaming out in front of him. As they whistled through the air, they transformed into a huge greatsword that slashed toward the 3 Vile Emperor Dynasty Celestials. Sima Yunhua, Celestial Aged Spirit and Chen Su all knew that time was of the essence, and therefore, resorted to trump cards. Rumbling booms resounded in all heaven and earth as the two sides clashed. Blood sprayed out of Reverend Devourer's mouth as he was flung backward, seriously injured. From the way that blood continued to ooze out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, and from how seemed to be tottering on the verge of collapse, it was obvious to anyone that he had done everything he could to hold his own. Unfortunately, he alone was not powerful enough. Prince Demon actually wasn't hurt very badly. Reverend Devourer had intentionally leapt in the way of most of the divine abilities, and if Prince Demon couldn't see through the man's plan, then he didn't deserve to have lived as long as he had. Wily old fox. Obviously, Reverend Devourer hoped that by coming out of the fight injured, he would avoid punishment by the Vile Emperor. Prince Demon had considered doing the same thing, but unfortunately, his cultivation base was lower than Reverend Devourer's, making it impossible. Although he was coughing up some blood, it wasn't nearly as dramatic as what was happening with Reverend Devourer. Therefore, he also let out a scream and then slapped himself on the chest. A muffled boom could be heard as his chest caved in and he tumbled backward. Even Reverend Devourer was impressed. What a wily old fox. Reverend Devourer thought, snorting coldly and trying to look as injured as possible. Gongsun Wan'er was also coughing up blood, but before anything serious could happen to her, Bai Xiaochun glanced over with a glare and shouted, "I'll take your life this day, Ghost Mother." Shifting directions, he shot toward her. Meanwhile, Gu Tianjun and the other Celestials continued onward. Even as Gongsun Wan'er looked on in shock, Bai Xiaochun shot toward her and waved his sleeve, causing black smoke to spread out in all directions. Taking advantage of the cover provided by the smoke, he then took out a chunk of the sovereign flesh and tossed it over to her. Eyes widening, she caught the chunk of flesh and put it away. At this point, Bai Xiaochun screamed and threw himself out of the black smoke. "The fight between us isn't over yet, Ghost Mother," he shouted, racing to catch up with Gu Tianjun and the others. Because Reverend Devourer and Prince Demon were injured, they didn't notice anything odd about the encounter. But Gu Tianjun and the other Saint Emperor Dynasty Celestials could guess what had just occurred. As soon as Bai Xiaochun caught up, he realized that Sima Yunhua and Celestial Aged Spirit were looking at him strangely. As for Gu Tianjun and Chen Su, although they weren't looking at him, it wasn't possible for them to cover up the awkward expressions that had appeared on their faces. Blinking a few times, Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat and said, "I'm a bit smitten, so I gave her a chunk of sovereign flesh." The other Celestials were immediately taken aback by his openness and honesty. "You, damn," Celestial Aged Spirit said, chuckling. For some reason, he only continued to find this Bai Xiaochun more and more amusing, and realized that his previous impression of him had been formed when they were rivals, and wasn't really accurate. Chen Su was smiling and shaking his head, and even Gu Tianjun and Sima Yunhua seemed to be changing their opinion of Bai Xiaochun. Clearing his throat, Sima Yunhua patted his bag of holding with its chunk of sovereign flesh and said, "You know, Celestial Ghost Mother has never had a Taoist partner. Well, I hope it works out for you, Celestial Bai. You're looking at it the wrong way, Bai Xiaochun said, a proud look on his face. Despite the fact that he was flying through the air at top speed, he still managed to flick his sleeve. You see, I'm really good at picking up girls. So don't hope that it works out for me, fellow Taoist, hope that it works out for her. After all, I'm the outstanding, attractive one. Yep, sometimes I actually fall in love with myself. At this point, the other Celestials fell into silence, effectively ending the conversation. None of them were really sure how to talk to Bai Xiaochun. When Bai Xiaochun saw how speechless they were, he got a bit more excited, and went on. You don't believe me? Well, just wait until we're out of this place. Then I'll show you all the love letters I got back in the lands of Heavenspan. You know how many I have in my collection? Too many. Probably more than 100,000. The rest of the way, he continued to recount his experiences with love. Eventually, not even Gu Tianjun was sure whether to laugh or cry, and was slowly beginning to warm up to him. Bai Xiaochun bragged his way until they were closing in on the exit. However, that was when a howl of rage could be heard behind them as Celestial Virupaxa and the other Celestials put everything on the line to try to catch up to them. However, the Saint Emperor Dynasty Celestials were well prepared, and produced medicinal pills that were perfect for the occasion. Aged Spirit even tossed one over to Bai Xiaochun. Take this acceleration pill, he said, for 3 breaths of time, you'll be able to move many times faster than normal. It's an expensive pill, but at the moment, that doesn't matter. With that, he popped one of the pills into his mouth, as did the other Celestials. Of course, considering Bai Xiaochun's understanding of medicinal pills, it only took a glance for him to confirm that it wasn't poisonous. Eyes glittering, he accepted it and popped it into his mouth. However, Celestial Aged Spirit didn't realize that, and to him, it seemed more like a reflection of how much Bai Xiaochun trusted him. It left him feeling deeply moved, although he didn't say anything. Nodding at Bai Xiaochun, he began to accelerate under the effects of the pill. As for Bai Xiaochun, as soon as the pill dissolved in his mouth, he felt a potent energy building up in him, something hot and explosive. In the blink of an eye, he was moving at incredible speed. 5 beams of light shot through the air toward the exit, on the other side of which sat the Saint Emperor and the Vile Emperor, their eyes glittering brightly. Of course, the Saint Emperor's eyes glittered with delight, and the Vile Emperor's glittered with something far different. When Virupaxa saw that look in the Vile Emperor's eyes, he suddenly pulled out a jade slip and crushed it. The crushing of the jade slip stimulated his Daoseed, even destroying a fraction of it, all to give him an incredible burst of speed. Everything around him distorted, almost as if he were manipulating both space and time. Before Bai Xiaochun and his companions could make it through the exit, Virupaxa was closing in on them, and reaching out to grab Sima Yunhua. Of course, he really wanted to grab Bai Xiaochun, but Sima Yunhua was in the way. And Celestial Virupaxa knew that if he made a move on the group as a whole, they would all turn to fight him. Therefore, he targeted a single person. As far as he was concerned, the chances of the other 4 turning to help that single person were virtually none. Except, Bai Xiaochun was not the type of person who did things the way Virupaxa would expect. Everyone else was concerned about the sovereign-level flesh, but Bai Xiaochun was more concerned about the potential of Sima Yunhua owing him a favor. When Sima Yunhua saw himself being trapped by Virupaxa's divine ability, his face went dark, and he began to curse in despair. He was convinced that he was done for. Not only would he lose any possible rewards, but he would probably end up as a captive of the Vile Emperor Dynasty. Enraged, he shouted, Virupaxa, you! But before he could say anything else, another shout of rage drowned him out. Virupaxa! How dare you mess with my good friend? The shout was so powerful that it shook heaven and earth, startling both Celestial Virupaxa and Sima Yunhua, and leaving their ears ringing. Most bizarre of all was that Sima Yunhua didn't recognize this voice, and couldn't help but wonder who this person was that he was good friends with. Gu Tianjun, Chen Su and Aged Spirit were also completely taken by surprise, as were the Vile Emperor and Saint Emperor, who were just outside of the exit. To all of them, it seemed like a completely ridiculous situation. Of course, the person who had just shouted out was none other than Bai Xiaochun. To him, the sovereign flesh wasn't very important anymore. In contrast, friendships were. That was why he had shared the flesh with the other Celestials of the Saint Emperor Dynasty, and even with Gongsun Wan'er. He was actually very pleased with how it seemed to be changing the other Celestials' opinion of him. Right now, Sima Yunhua was in danger. Although he likely wouldn't die, if Virupaxa captured him, Sima Yunhua would likely lose the sovereign flesh that Bai Xiaochun had given him. Furthermore, it would happen right in front of the Vile Emperor and Saint Emperor. Virupaksha would shine, and although he would have lost out overall inside the spiderweb, he would at least have performed some meritorious service worthy of a reward. In contrast, Sima Yunhua would lose not just the sovereign flesh, but also a lot of face too. To Celestials, that type of thing was very important. Bai Xiaochun realized all of that in the briefest of moments. To him, this opportunity was like a little sheep, and he was a big grey wolf. Eyes shining, he snatched at the opportunity as soon as it presented himself. Without hesitation, he produced the great sword of the north and slashed it out toward Virupaksha. And of course, he didn't forget to shout something appropriate as he attacked. "Run, Sima, old pal. Don't worry about me, I'll hold him off." Although his words seemed a bit melodramatic, anyone who was watching could see that he intended to follow through in action. He really was placing himself in danger and going all out in an attempt to help Sima Yunhua. Sima Yunhua was usually a grim individual, but in this moment, he was uncharacteristically moved, and suddenly experienced feelings that were very foreign to him. "I won't leave you behind, Bai, my friend," he shouted. And thus, both Bai Xiaochun and Sima Yunhua drew upon their most powerful trump cards to strike back at celestial Virupaksha. Booms rang out in all directions, and massive winds swept the area. Although Sima Yunhua was no match for Virupaksha in terms of cultivation base, he had a huge amount of experience, and thus, attacked in a very effective manner. Bai Xiaochun, despite being in the mid-celestial realm, had a world treasure, which shone with blue light as he viciously attacked Virupaksha. Power that seemed capable of destroying the heavens and extinguishing the earth was unleashed. Sima Yunhua bore the brunt of the attacks, causing his chest to cave in and blood to spray out of his mouth. In the critical moment, Bai Xiaochun defended him with his sword and then grabbed his shoulder. Then, sonic booms could be heard as the two of them flew backward at high speed. Sima Yunhua was feeling genuinely moved, and thought back to when he had been working hard to oppose Bai Xiaochun. For the first time, he felt a bit guilty about that. Meanwhile, Virupaksha, whose divine abilities had been vanquished by the two of them, was descending into a rage. "Feeling suicidal, Bai Xiaochun?" he shouted. Then he thought about how his arm was now gone because of Bai Xiaochun, and his eyes turned bloodshot with rage. Slapping himself hard on the chest, he damaged his Dao seed even more to fuel his cultivation base and achieve another burst of speed. Throwing his arms out in front of him, he aimed, not for Sima Yunhua, but Bai Xiaochun. "Let's see if anyone will come to save you." However, even as Virupaksha prepared to attack, Sima Yunhua gritted his teeth and beat him to the punch. He couldn't simply abandon Bai Xiaochun after having just been saved by him. Perhaps if the two of them had been alone, he might have considered it, but with so many people watching, that would be too much of a disgrace. Simultaneously, Celestial Aged Spirit and Chen Su both hesitated for a moment, then turned around. After all, if their inaction caused Bai Xiaochun and Sima Yunhua to be captured, the Saint Emperor would not be pleased with them at all. Furthermore, considering how things had developed, it was likely that Sima Yunhua would hold a grudge against them if they didn't help. Jiyu Tianjun also hesitated for a moment, then sighed and also turned to help. The three of them all attacked at the same time, which, when combined with the counter-attack by Bai Xiaochun and Sima Yunhua, created a massive storm of magical techniques that bore down on Celestial Virupaksha. How could this be happening? Celestial Virupaksha said with a gasp. He knew all of the Celestials from the Saint Emperor Dynasty, and was sure that unless there was some benefit at stake, they wouldn't possibly work together like this. And if they had conflicting interests, they definitely wouldn't do so. What he was seeing now seemed completely implausible. Unfortunately, even the mighty Virupaksha couldn't stand up to the combined attacks of 5 other Celestials. Coughing up blood, he tumbled backward, body on the verge of collapse. With Virupaksha having been taken out of the picture temporarily, Bai Xiaochun grabbed Sima Yunhua and sped toward the exit as quickly as possible. Then, to the shock of the Vile Emperor and Saint Emperor, the 5 of them all emerged into the open, gasping for breath. At this point, even Jiyu Tianjun breathed a sigh of relief. As for Sima Yunhua, he seemed relieved, and quickly clasped hands and bowed to Bai Xiaochun. He said nothing, but from the look in his eyes, it was obvious that he would not forget what had just played out. Bai Xiaochun felt immensely proud, but didn't let it show on his face. Instead, he lowered his voice and asked all of the other Celestials how they were doing, and if they were all right. As for the Vile Emperor and the Saint Emperor, one looked livid, and the other surprised. Neither spoke. Before long, Celestial Virupaksha emerged from the exit, clutching at his stomach, his expression as dark as could be. Shortly after came Reverend Devourer and Prince Demon. And then were Celestial Deadfall, Taoist Heavenspan, and Gongsun Wanner. Soon, all of the Celestials were out in the open, with the exception of the old woman. When Celestial Virapaksa produced her Deoseed and handed it over, the vile emperor simply could not cover up the grim expression on his face. In sharp contrast, the Saint Emperor gave a hearty belly laugh. Looking at his Celestials, he said, "Very well. Excellent work, my Celestials. And now, please produce the fruits of your labor. As I said before, everyone who participated will be rewarded for their meritorious service." Gu Tianjun cleared his throat and stepped forward excitedly. Waving his sleeve, he sent several chunks of sovereign flesh out. At the same time, Chen Su, Celestial Aged Spirit and Sima Yunhua all did the same. Seeing this, Bai Xiaochun joined them. Perhaps to intentionally annoy the Celestials from the Vile Emperor dynasty, Gu Tianjun took the lead in assembling all of the pieces. At that point, Bai Xiaochun's heart began to pound, but sadly, there was nothing he could do to stop what was happening. Before long, a big lizard took shape, causing the Saint Emperor's eyes to shine brightly, and killing intent to appear in the Vile Emperor's. However, after putting all of the pieces together, strange expressions appeared on the faces of all present, as they realized that the lizard appeared to be missing half of a leg, along with its tail. Off to the side, Gongsun Wanner's face was bright crimson. A moment passed, then she stepped forward. Then, to the amazement of her compatriots, she pulled half of a leg out of her bag of holding and tossed it out in front of her. The Vile Emperor's expression brightened at that, and he looked over at Gongsun Wanner and nodded approvingly. However, even with the missing half of a leg provided by Gongsun Wanner, the lizard wasn't whole. At that point, the Celestials of both dynasties slowly turned to look at Bai Xiaochun, causing the jaws of both the Vile Emperor and the Saint Emperor to drop. It's never good to show off, Bai Xiaochun thought. Gu Tianjun and those others went way too far. Why did they have to go and put all the pieces together? Feeling a bit guilty, he sighed inwardly. It was a bit embarrassing to have the Celestials from both of the imperial dynasties staring at him in this way. After a moment, he couldn't help but clear his throat a bit. "Hey, you're right. Seems it's missing the tail." Suddenly, he smacked his forehead and tried to seem very forgetful. "Oh, I remember now. My memory isn't what it used to be. I totally forgot that I have the tail right here." He quickly pulled out the tail of the lizard and threw it over. Blinking a few times, he said, "Hey, stop looking at me like that. I really forgot." Gu Tianjun glared at him for a moment longer before looking away, whereas Sima Yunhua, because of the favor just now, could only shake his head and smile wryly. Neither Chen Su nor Aged Spirit could think of anything to say. The Celestials from the Vile Emperor dynasty seemed similarly at a loss for words, although their hatred for Bai Xiaochun continued to mount. Only Gongsun Wanner maintained a purely cold face, although inwardly, she was laughing. Now that the fighting was over and the competition had come to an end, the Saint Emperor looked at the lizard, and then at Bai Xiaochun, an enigmatic smile playing out on his face. "King Heavenspan, why is it that the tail seems abnormally short?" In response to his words, the Celestials all looked closer at the lizard, and sure enough, the lizard's tail seemed a bit misshapen, almost as if it were missing a piece. "This Saint Emperor's eyes are viciously sharp." Bai Xiaochun moaned inwardly. However, he maintained a confused expression on his face and looked over at the lizard. After a moment, he smacked his head again. "Iya, seriously, my memory is getting really bad. Yeah, you're right, it is missing a piece." With that, he pulled out another chunk of the lizard from his bag of holding and tossed it over. Seeing the Saint Emperor looking at him thoughtfully, he said in his most sincere voice, "That's it. This time I really don't have any more." After watching all of this play out, the surrounding Celestials felt as though they were meeting Bai Xiaochun for the first time. They were actually quite shaken. His tendency to try to pilfer things for himself left them literally speechless. And that was especially true when they realized that the extra chunk he had thrown out didn't seem to make the tail look whole. Oh so slowly, all of the Celestials looked away from the lizard and back to Bai Xiaochun again. The Saint Emperor didn't say a single word. The enigmatic smile remained on his face, and yet, the ill will in his eyes was readily apparent. "I really don't have any more," Bai Xiaochun said. This time, he was telling the truth. He really didn't have any more chunks of flesh in his bag of holding. At this point, the Vile Emperor smiled contemptuously, performed an incantation gesture and pointed out. A ray of black light shot out from his finger, heading directly toward the big lizard. The ray of light clearly had some fantastic properties. As soon as it sank into the lizard, its flesh began to wriggle and knit back together. Within a few short moments, it looked like it had never been broken apart. However, now it was more obvious than ever that there was still a piece missing from its tail. And now, All of the Celestials and both of the Archeans were looking at Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun was now alarmed to the very core, and was wailing inwardly. After all, the final piece that was missing was the one he had given to the spirit automaton. Although he was a bit guilty, he reminded himself that he had put himself in a lot of dangerous situations to get this lizard for the Saint Emperor. It's better to be confident than to try to pull a fast one, he thought. Having reached this point in his train of thought, he took a deep breath and decisively said, I ate it. I ate that missing piece. That sovereign flesh and blood is good stuff. I got it, and wanted to do a bit of research. In the end, I failed. So I decided to eat a bit to see what it would do. Sadly, it's completely disgusting, and didn't do anything at all. Inwardly, he was grumbling about how stingy these Archeans were. It was just a tiny chunk, wasn't it? When the surrounding Celestials heard Bai Xiaochun freely admitting this, their eyes glittered in satisfaction. After all, for a Celestial to pilfer a bit of sovereign flesh that was intended for an Archean wasn't really a very big deal. If Bai Xiaochun had tried to hide the fact, they might come up with other conclusions about what he had done. But considering how directly he was stating things, not even the Saint Emperor felt the need to investigate the matter further, and simply glared at Bai Xiaochun. I'm surprised he didn't get killed doing that, he murmured inwardly. I can't believe he dared to eat sovereign flesh. After that, he ignored Bai Xiaochun and looked over at the vile Emperor, with whom he transmitted a short conversation. The Saint Emperor held the upper hand, and the vile Emperor would be forced to deal with the fact that he had lost. However, the two of them had come to an agreement ahead of time, and therefore, the vile Emperor would still get 2 portions of the flesh and blood. Before leaving, he cast a frosty glance at Bai Xiaochun, then flicked his sleeve and vanished. Celestial Virupaxa and his fellows did the same, secretly hating Bai Xiaochun down to their bones. Only Gongsun Wan'er felt differently, although it was impossible to detect that within her gaze. The matter of the sovereign clone was now concluded. All of the Saint Emperor's Celestials, including Bai Xiaochun, received a celestial pill for their contributions. After everyone left, Bai Xiaochun took advantage of the fact that the northern prefectures were now empty to bring out all of the people who were inside the Great Sword of the North. Not only would Misty Sea Prefecture be restored, but Bai Xiaochun took advantage of the extremely rare circumstances to expand his territory. It only took a few months for him to take over all 5 of the northern prefectures. He did it with such speed and ferocity that not even the vile Emperor could do anything to stop him. After all, the vile Emperor dynasty had experienced the recent death of a celestial, and although it wasn't a permanently devastating loss, it was still significant. Furthermore, considering the momentum that Bai Xiaochun had built up, only Virupaxa could have been sent to oppose him. None of the other celestials qualified. Most important of all was the fact that the north of the second immortal domain had been almost completely turned into nothing more than dust. Dead lands like that were of little interest or value to the vile Emperor dynasty. The entire thing was a bit annoying to the Saint Emperor, but considering that he was distracted by the sovereign's flesh and blood, he wasn't paying very close attention. Another factor that played into the overall situation was that Bai Xiaochun now had a much better relationship with Celestial Aged Spirit, who tacitly approved of his actions. And thus, in only a few months, Bai Xiaochun unified the north to a large extent. Although it was mostly a dusty wasteland now, the citizens of Misty Sea Prefecture were already working hard to bring things back to normal. Bai Xiaochun's name was even more well-known now, and more people came to know how strong he was. Did you hear? King Heavenspan managed to steal a precious treasure away from all of the other Celestials. The part about the treasure is nothing. There were more than a dozen Celestials trying to track him down, but they couldn't find him for a whole 10 days. When he showed up again, he played his cards so perfectly that all of the Celestials in the Saint Emperor dynasty started to like him. Then he led them out, and got celestial pills for all of them as a reward. You don't see that every day. As word spread through the eternal immortal domains, the people of Heavenspan heard, and were deeply inspired. Meanwhile, Song Junwan, under the protective care of Bruiser, finally made contact with Patriarch Spirit Stream, Li Qinghao, and those who were with them. Everything seemed to be progressing wonderfully until, without any warning at all, an imperial decree was sent to Bai Xiaochun from Saint Emperor City. The imperial decree only contained a single sentence. As King Heavenspan, Bai Xiaochun is hereby formally appointed as the Saint Emperor dynasty's ambassador in Vile Emperor City. Technically speaking, Bai Xiaochun would still be the king of the north in the second immortal domain, but for all intents and purposes, he would no longer serve in that role. He would be the official ambassador stationed in Vile Emperor City. Both imperial dynasties had ambassadors in each other's capital cities. Usually, they were demigods with long records of service, although occasionally celestials would also serve in that role. Sima Yunhua was the former ambassador, except that he didn't actually visit the Vile Emperor dynasty very often. Most of his time was spent in Saint Emperor City. Unfortunately, Sima Yunhua had been wounded in the fight with Celestial Virupaxa, so whether he wanted to or not, his responsibilities were being transferred to Bai Xiaochun. The truth was that the Saint Emperor had been planning this for a while. As Misty Sea Prefecture rose to prominence, the Saint Emperor soon came to realize how valuable it was, and therefore, Bai Xiaochun's presence there became a bit of a headache. Unfortunately, Bai Xiaochun was special, and therefore, the Saint Emperor had to be very careful about how he treated him. After all, his ultimate goal was to make sure the Heavenspan realm cultivators had a good opinion of his own dynasty. He didn't want to do anything to ruin his reputation. Transferring Bai Xiaochun to a position in the Vile Emperor dynasty was essentially eliminating him without having to do so directly. Even if it was only a temporary arrangement, it would conform with his plans. Besides, Bai Xiaochun had performed meritorious service, and had also improved his relationship with the other Celestials. That not only put the Saint Emperor on guard, it helped him make his decision. There was nothing threatening about the imperial decree. It merely mentioned his new position and gave him a deadline to accept the appointment. However, Bai Xiaochun could almost see the Saint Emperor's cold, hypocritical eyes when reading it. There's definitely a hidden threat here. If I refuse to comply, he can do all sorts of things to me. Sighing, he summoned the Grand Heaven Master and Giant Ghost King and shared the imperial decree with them. This Saint Emperor is a complete bully, the Giant Ghost King said angrily. Xiaochun, you just performed a great service, and now, only a few months later, he treats you like this? Bai Xiaochun was already scowling on the verge of tears. He knew that Vile Emperor City was a dangerous place, not because people would attack him openly, but because of the intrigue and scheming that went on there. Even worse, during the incident with the sovereign clone, he had offended virtually all of the top experts in the Vile Emperor dynasty. I guess as long as I'm extremely careful, it won't be that dangerous. That was the only way he could comfort himself. After all, the Saint Emperor's unspoken threat was obvious. If he refused, then Misty Sea Prefecture, which he had just worked so hard to get back into shape, would be targeted by the Saint Emperor. The Giant Ghost King could see Bai Xiaochun hesitating. Snorting coldly, he said, Xiaochun, if you accept the position, do you think the Saint Emperor will make a move against Misty Sea Prefecture? Up to this point, the Grand Heaven Master hadn't spoken. He had been examining the imperial decree the whole time. Now, he looked up and said, perhaps, this is a good opportunity. The Giant Ghost King and Bai Xiaochun both looked over at him, eyes shining with anticipation. Bai Xiaochun knew that the Grand Heaven Master was a master of plots and schemes. After all, in the thousands of years that he had practiced cultivation, he had turned into the most ultimate of wily old foxes. First of all, although it might seem like going to Vile Emperor City will put you in danger, it actually won't. As a Celestial, and the ambassador, everyone from the Saint Emperor dynasty will be paying attention to what happens to you. If anything bad happens, it would likely result in a war between the two dynasties. Therefore, in some respects, your status will strike fear into the hearts of the people of the Vile Emperor dynasty. The second benefit is that there are many people of Heavenspan in the Vile Emperor dynasty, more than in the Saint Emperor dynasty. After all, the Vile Emperor dynasty is huge. By going there and getting involved with the government, it will be much easier for you to find them and bring them back. Another factor is that, although things seem to be going well here in the Saint Emperor dynasty, you don't have much room for growth. But if you could somehow get land of your own in the Vile Emperor dynasty, then we would be in a much better position. In the end, you have few options. If you refuse to comply, then we might as well leave Misty Sea Prefecture and defect to the Vile Emperor dynasty. If you comply, then I vehemently request that you demand the Saint Emperor give Misty Sea Prefecture 10 years of full autonomy. With that, the Grand Heaven Master clasped hands, bowed to Bai Xiaochun, and waited for an answer. The Giant Ghost King stood off to the side, staying silent. Bai Xiaochun looked at the two of them, and then at the imperial decree. Finally, he sighed. Ever since he had come to the eternal immortal domains, he felt less free than he had in the Heavenspan realm. He was always under pressure, and always restrained in some way or another. In the past, he had always been able to do whatever he wanted, but not anymore. Eyes bloodshot, he pondered the situation for a short moment, then gritted his teeth and took out a transmission jade slip. Without any hesitation, he sent a message to the Saint Emperor informing him of some demands. At this point, he had risen high enough in the world that he qualified to negotiate with an Archean. Before long, the Saint Emperor replied, granting his demands. There was no need for pretenses between the two of them now. He directly granted Bai Xiaochun's request to leave Misty Sea Prefecture alone for 10 years. During that time, the Saint Emperor would not interfere with the prefecture in any way. But after the 10 years were up, it would return to the Saint Emperor dynasty's control. 10 years. I'll have 10 years to secure land within the vile Emperor dynasty. Having made his decision, he accepted the position of ambassador. A few days later, he left. He notified the Grand Heaven Master and some other important people, but didn't make a huge fanfare. Considering his status, he didn't need to cross the Eternal Sea to reach his destination. He first went to the capital city of the second immortal domain to visit Celestial Aged Spirit. When Aged Spirit learned of the news, he hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. Fellow Taoist Bai, I can guarantee you that no matter what the Saint Emperor does, as far as I'm concerned, Misty Sea Prefecture will always belong to you. Aged Spirit and the Saint Emperor had their differences, and as such, Aged Spirit was not very happy with this new decree. When Bai Xiaochun first came to the second immortal domain, there had been a bit of tension between him and Aged Spirit. But things had been smoothed out, and they had lived in harmony ever since. Furthermore, having two celestials in one immortal domain actually made for a much stronger force. Bai Xiaochun was moved by Celestial Aged Spirit's guarantee. After offering formal thanks, he went to the teleportation portal. Soon, rumbling sounds could be heard, and he faded away from the second immortal domain. When he reappeared, he was no longer in the territory of the Saint Emperor dynasty. He was in the Vile Emperor dynasty, specifically, the immortal domain where the capital city was located. Vile Emperor City was surrounded by 5 heavenly mountains, atop each of which was a spell formation that connected the city to locations in the other immortal domains. With such teleportation portals, the eternal immortal domains were not so vastly large that travel between them was impossible. Saint Emperor City also had such teleportation formations, although they weren't often used. After all, both parties had to agree to activate the teleportation portals at the same time. This was Bai Xiaochun's first time teleporting into the Vile Emperor dynasty. As soon as he appeared, he looked around, and saw a dozen or so cultivators from the Saint Emperor dynasty, who were to be his subordinates. 2 were demigods, with the rest being devas. When they caught sight of him, they clasped hands in formal greeting. Well met, King Heavenspan. Bai Xiaochun didn't respond. He stood there on the spell formation atop the heavenly mountain, feeling the cold air and looking off into the violet clouds, within which he could see the occasional streak of lightning. It was very different from Saint Emperor City. Everything was dark and awe-inspiring. There was something bloodthirsty about the whole place. Beneath the violet clouds, in the middle of the 5 heavenly mountains, was a valley. Right in the middle of the valley was a massive trident sticking straight up into the sky. It was fully 300 meters wide, and from what Bai Xiaochun could see, was some sort of magical item. There was something shockingly powerful about it, and most astonishing of all was that coiled around the trident was an enormous bone dragon. Half of the trident was stabbed deep into the earth, and the other half rose up into the violet clouds. It was a profoundly astonishing sight. As for the bone dragon which coiled around it, it was vicious beyond compare. It only had half of a skull left, but it still radiated an intense murderous aura. The bones weren't stuck to the trident itself, just hanging off of it in shocking fashion. Despite the fact that he was a celestial, even Bai Xiaochun was shaken by the ferocious scene. Vile Emperor City itself was built on the bones of that bone dragon. Numerous buildings and structures could be seen there. As for the skull, it was the foundation of the imperial palace. The palace itself was in the violet clouds, surrounded by countless bolts of lightning. There was something frantic, even maddened about this city that made it completely different from Saint Emperor City. Almost as soon as Bai Xiaochun caught sight of the imperial palace, a stream of divine sense erupted from within it, something profoundly domineering, something that surpassed celestials on the most fundamental level. His eyes almost hurt because of it, and he began to pant. Obviously, this was the will of the Vile Emperor. So this is Vile Emperor City. Shaken, he looked at the dozen or so cultivators standing around the teleportation formation, hands still clasped in greeting. Standing behind the Saint Emperor dynasty cultivators were 2 demigods from Vile Emperor City. They stood there very respectfully, and yet, deep in their eyes was an insufferable arrogance that they did nothing to hide. As soon as they realized he was looking at them, they also clasped hands in greetings. Welcome, Celestial Bai. Bai Xiaochun was not in the best of moods, and although the demigods were acting respectfully, he could tell how full of themselves they were. At the same time, it was obvious that they were afraid of him. As for the other cultivators, they were even more on edge. Muttering to himself, Bai Xiaochun stepped out of the teleportation formation and waved his hand. Rise, he said. The Saint Emperor Dynasty cultivators breathed sighs of relief as they rose from their bows. They had been working for Sima Yunhua for some time, only to suddenly have a change in ambassadors. To top it off, the new ambassador was the famous King Heavenspan, Bai Xiaochun. None of them knew anything about his temperament, and they were thus very nervous about what could happen. Considering that Sima Yunhua didn't tell me anything about these people, I guess that means he didn't view them as being very important. After looking the group over, Bai Xiaochun realized that all of them looked dispirited to some degree, even the demigods. But that made sense, considering that they were from the Saint Emperor Dynasty, and were stuck in the terrifying Vile Emperor city. If true conflict erupted between the two dynasties, this group would be the first to lose their heads. Shaking his head, he maintained silence as he followed the two Vile Emperor Dynasty demigods off of the heavenly mountain. As they neared the city itself, Bai Xiaochun could already sense that its population greatly surpassed that of Saint Emperor City. The moment he stepped into the city itself, 5 or 6 streams of divine sense locked onto him. Slowing down for a moment, he sent his own divine sense out to make contact with them. Although no one could see that moment of contact, it left Bai Xiaochun feeling very shaken. After all, those streams of divine sense belonged to the celestials in the city. However, considering his status as the ambassador from the Saint Emperor Dynasty, he knew that as long as he didn't make any mistakes, no one would be able to do anything to him, at least not easily. And as it turned out, after making initial contact, the other streams of divine sense faded away. At that point, he pulled his own divine sense back in and continued on with the two demigods, who had sensed that something strange was going on, but weren't sure what. Bai Xiaochun didn't hurry. He looked around at the streets and the people of Vile Emperor City and was unsure about how he felt. After all, this place was completely unfamiliar to him. However, despite the unfamiliar surroundings, he could sense the auras of Heavenspan realm cultivators, quite a few in fact. Sadly, the auras were weak. He could only imagine how many people were imprisoned here, unable to escape. Here in the Vile Emperor Dynasty, the prevailing view was that people from the Heavenspan realm were to be enslaved. And Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base was not so great that he could simply ignore the laws of the land and do what he wished. Sighing, he hurried along until the Saint Emperor Dynasty's embassy was visible up ahead, on the lower half of the bone dragon's spine. It was 5 stories tall, and surrounded by a sprawling courtyard. Overall it was very impressive, especially considering the powerful spell formation fluctuations rolling out from it. At a cursory glance, Bai Xiaochun could tell that even a celestial who wanted to break through that formation would have a difficult time of it. That made him feel a little bit better. The cultivators who had come to receive him from the embassy were visibly relieved to return. After entering, the 2 Vile Emperor Dynasty demigods left, and Bai Xiaochun sat down in the main hall of the embassy. Looking at his subordinates, who were lined up in front of him, he asked, "So, what are my responsibilities?" Unsure of what type of person Bai Xiaochun was, they didn't dare to withhold anything, and quickly gave him an overview of the situation. Exalted Celestial, you normally don't have to do anything. As long as the 2 dynasties aren't in conflict, you just need to make a public appearance every once in a while. Occasionally you'll be summoned by the Vile Emperor. Since you've just taken over as ambassador, it's likely you'll soon receive such a summons. Exalted Celestial, please be careful here. After all, this is Vile Emperor City. He nodded. What's so dangerous about this place? He asked. The assembled cultivators exchanged glances and whispered among themselves for a moment. Then, the highest-ranking demigod stepped forward, clasped hands, and bowed. Exalted One, you need to abide by all of the laws and customs of the Vile Emperor Dynasty. And you need to be careful of people intentionally causing problems. Although the man was being vague, Bai Xiaochun understood what he was getting at. After discussing a few other matters with the group, and coming to understand the city a bit more, he dismissed them, and sat there to think. It's a foregone conclusion that people will try to cause problems for me, he thought. Massaging his temples, he contemplated the fact that if his cultivation base were high enough, he wouldn't need to worry about such things. Hold on a second. Suddenly, he smacked his forehead. Usually, I cause grief for people whenever I go somewhere new. The way it usually works is, I show up, and everything goes like normal for a while. But then, for some unknown reason, things always change. He suddenly realized that he had been thinking about everything the wrong way. After reminiscing about how many drums and gongs he had heard throughout the years, he blinked a few times, and suddenly felt a lot better. Clearing his throat, he tried to pump himself up a bit. This vile emperor must be a complete idiot. The Saint Emperor wants me to be the ambassador, and he just agreed right off the bat? You know, a lot of people have said that, given the right circumstances, I could easily destroy the world. As of now, he felt the tension beginning to melt away, and even felt a bit sorry for the vile emperor. It was starting to get dark outside, and considering how much better he felt, he decided to take a stroll around the embassy. Eventually, he found a private chamber perfect for practicing cultivation, so he sat down to do some meditation. I need to go check out the damaged fan, and pass some more levels there. One of these days, I'll reach the 100th level, and when I get that reward, my cultivation will progress a lot faster. Having reached this point in his train of thought, he closed his eyes and disappeared. When he materialized, he was back on the damaged fan. After calling out a few greetings, he confirmed that the spirit automaton was asleep, whereupon he headed toward the next level. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.